Thanks everybody for joining. We'll start off with a couple introductions and kind of go over briefly with some of the high-level topics. In the end, we just want to expose what other people are doing with the application Intapp and how they leverage that system for intake and conflicts, as well as even other pieces that maybe not a lot of firms are doing. We'll start off and kind of go down the list that we see on screen. My name, like Monica said, my name is Kurt Russell. I'm Managing Director here at Wilson Allen, and I'm going to be the panelist today. And then Augustine, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Augustine Contra. I'm our Director of Technical Solutions, which means I do a lot of sort of our architecture analysis, try to make the technical side of implementations a little bit more efficient. I've been working with Intapp risk platform / Intapp Open for almost a decade now, 9 years. And I'm based in Burlington, Vermont.
Thank you, Augustine. Jenny Leth.
Hi, everybody. Jenny Leth Pignano. Going by JP these days. But I've been with Wilson for the last 8 years and have worn many different hats, from project manager, business consultant, and tech developer. These days, as Director of Operations, I'm more focused on continuous process improvements for our processes and really identifying best practices to enrich our clients' experiences. So.
Thanks, JP. Rich?
Hello, I'm Rich Maurer. I'm the Business Development Director for our Intapp practice. I've been at Wilson for just under 8 years, and I've spent just over 20 in legal tech now. I'm based in sunny Cleveland, Ohio. As you can see, there's some sun coming in from outside today. It's a good day.
Yeah, it looks beautiful there, Rich. All right, so this team is on this webinar because they have a lot of experience. They've worked with a lot of different law firms and gone through a lot of implementations, whether it be on-prem systems, cloud systems, going from on-prem to cloud. So we're going to try to expose some of the things that we've done at other firms that we saw value and they also saw value in, and then just things on project structure, because that all kind of ties in with ROI. That being said, I'm going to start with Augustine. I'm going to ask him a question around data analytics, and this usually has to do with at the project end. So we have all these systems in place. How do we take a look at what we're doing to pinpoint potential improvements or where we're really good at? So Augustine, that being said, what do you see in the Intapp application for data analytics, and how do we pull that out to identify some of those bits and pieces I just kind of described?
Yeah, so with pretty much every conflicts and intake implementation, Intapp risk comes sort of right out of the box with some baked-in reporting functionality. That'll give you, a basic sense of how long it takes on average to process a request, or how many requests you're processing, sort of that baselining data. But I think where Intapp can really shine is in the fact that, for every single request, it's tracking who approved this request at what stage, how long it took, how long did it take for a partner to respond when the conflicts analyst asked them a question, depending on how your workflow is set up. And so, that presents an opportunity for firms that they can basically, build a really robust analytics engine on top of that and get absolutely crystal clear data about where the bottlenecks are in their workflow. How long does it take, what kind of service are they turning around to their partners? So, you can see okay, it takes on average 4 days to clear this type of conflict search. And then when you dig in a little bit closer, you see, but for three and a half of those days, we were waiting for waivers from this partner. So it gives firms this really clear picture of what takes time in the process, where are folks spending their resources. And then they get this huge added benefit of when they go on to make additional process improvements, they have an objective measure of how successful those process improvements were, because they can see, well, hey, we implemented some new reminders that really pester the attorneys to get us our waivers, and boom, all of a sudden we just cut 2 days out of our average time. So I think there's a big opportunity there, and I love seeing clients take advantage of it.
Now, are you seeing a lot of firms using this, or is it something that you have a select few that use it? And if so, why?
I mean, I have some firms that are really, really ahead of the game on this, and you know, there have been some of my favorite projects to work on. But I do not think that the vast majority of firms are where they're getting the best bang for their buck. I think it's sort of an untapped. There's a lot of untapped potential there. I think what tends to happen is people, you know, sort of get through phase one, and then they focus on the process improvements without building the infrastructure to really support and analyze the value that they're getting out of those improvements. And to me, those sort of go hand in hand, you know, like the whole point of this webinar. So like getting the best bang for your buck. And if you're not measuring before and after you make the improvements, how do you know if you're getting the best bang for your buck?
That's right. Based on feeling, I guess. You know, I agree with you. I think a lot of, from my experience too, is we get so hyper focused on the phase one, and the firm does too. And those, so sometimes those take longer than expected. And that's always the thing that it comes later, but it's the can that's kicked down the road, right? But the great thing about it is, you know, a lot of times you hear ROI and have these numbers thrown out, but there's no solid backing on how you got to those numbers. With this, you can truly figure that out. So that's great. Thank you. Next topic I just want to jump on, continuing down the path of like reviewing data, and this is more with conflicts. And this question's for JP. In Intapp, you know, they keep making improvements to the conflicts process. A lot of firms are looking for things that help reduce risk, potentially speed things up, although speeding up doesn't always mean a better process for conflicts. A lot of times it's how big of a net do you want to throw out? What kind of results do you want to bring back? How do you review those? But JP, from a conflicts perspective, what do you see firms doing for quick wins to help risk mitigation, whether it's speeding up or just hyper focus on the risk mitigation side? What are you seeing firms do?
Well, as you know, like the conflicts module is so much more robust with, you know, the engine is so much more robust in regards to being able to bring in the data and searches that you have. So we, you know, and you have opportunities as well to bring in data from external data sources that from different systems, like bringing in target companies, potential clients that you're still, you know, that you're working on, are, you know, for sales opportunities, or you're looking at, you know, you're looking at bringing in vendors and those types of conflicts hits. So external data is so much more robust, but at the same time, then you ask, you know, you have more searches to go through and analyze. I think one of the modules that is really helpful for firms is the assisted conflicts. It's a really great tool for firms to start utilizing and getting into. I know it's a different way of working, but it really, I think, enhances the experience. It's like once you get comfortable, you see what type of data is being recommended for you to focus on. And, you know, the way that it categorizes it with uncertain issues, no issue, or excluded, I think really helps, you know, firms, especially if you don't necessarily have a really big conflicts team, or you're just, you know, kind of churning through and preparing reports for attorney. The assisted conflicts gives you that kind of comfort level to at least hone in the, you know, the items that you need to focus. So
just a question on one of the things you said. You mentioned external data. Not everybody probably knows what that is, but what does that mean from a conflicts perspective?
It's really just supplementing your information and your data, right? So typically what most firms do is they search against their clients, their matters, their party and party relationships. So with external data, you're able to connect to other systems, like, you know, your Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics. If you want to get hits on potentially what opportunities or pending, you know, project clients that you're going to be working on, so that you don't conflict yourself. Or, you know, if you're wanting to make sure that you don't have any conflicts with vendors that you're working with. Other things, of course, that also bring in is watch lists. You know, Intapp makes it easier to connect to watch lists and be able to search against it. So an easy integration with getting OFAC data, as well as, you know, European sanctions lists and so forth. So I think that is really, you know, again, supplementing the data that you're searching against, but then at the same time taking assisted conflicts and helping you parse through that data. So I think that's two things that really a lot of firms haven't been necessarily utilizing, being that it's fairly new. So.
Gotcha. And then for the assisted conflict side, you mentioned these buckets where it says issue, unknown or potential issue, and then people go in and take a look at those. I know, like in the past, we've worked with some firms where their structure is a conflicts analyst is maybe the first layer of review, and then the second layer of review is the conflicts attorney, and then there's potentially the attorneys are reviewing the hits that are their matters or whatever it be.
Yep.
But that first layer is where I think we see maybe they could leverage this piece of it, because a lot of times they're clicking a button, getting the results, and just sending raw or an unfiltered large set of data to the second level.
Yep.
And I think that's a piece where you're trying to get at is the efficiency there that's gained. What about like ranking rules and groupings? Have you worked with firms to leverage that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, really kind of utilizing the ranking rules and also like the importance flags really help, I think, firms also generate the necessary, you know, kind of target the information that, you know, they want their attorneys to look at. And it really helps kind of filter the information. So again, comes back to, you have an opportunity, you know, conflicts database is able to search so much and give you so much more, but it's a bit overwhelming. So utilizing the rules and doing ranking and really kind of bringing up, you know, bringing to the top these high issue items or, you know, potential risks, I think is really, again, a time saver for users, and really generating a more kind of more, you know, targeted report for attorneys, especially for folks that are wanting to get into the interactive conflicts report, right? If you're requiring approval for all of the line items in the report, you know, if it's categorized accordingly, that kind of that focus for the person approving it is there, it's provided, and then you also like limit the time that it's sitting on their desk versus, and you know, and they won't just necessarily be, hey, I have to submit all this, you know, just select all without really reviewing. Here, they're actually looking at the things that are uncertain, you know, and that can potentially bring risk to the firm. So.
And just to make it very simplistic of what ranking rules are, it's essentially a business rule that says, under these conditions, categorize it within this grouping. Very simplistic version of that. Cool. Thank you, JP. I appreciate that. Rich, you've been very patient. In your past experience, can you give us an example of a client that you worked with that's leveraged the system? I don't want to necessarily say beyond the norm, but not something we see firms heavily leveraging, probably because the same scenario that I talked to Augustine about, where they just don't have time in the project to leverage it.
Yeah, you know, I think from an intake and conflicts perspective, adding the document assembly piece always adds a ton of value, because you're already capturing many of the variables that you use in a typical engagement letter. So, you know, template out those engagement letters, and you're capturing addresses, attorney names, rates, and passing those right into a letter that you can generate sort of in line in that new business request. You can take that a step further and add in the digital signing component. So the workflow will wait for that signed document to come back before proceeding. So this is a time saver and also mitigates risk in your new business process.
Okay, so you're talking about the very common problem that we see at firms where they don't actually get a signed engagement letter because they don't want to wait for that letter to come back and have a matter generated.
And there's always that question, you know, the checkbox, do we have an engagement letter, you know, and upload it, but there's never any guardrails to make sure we're getting that back. So
Gotcha.
Adding in document assembly and generating that automatically and sending it out, that does this job for you.
So the document assembly module, you're talking about the Intapp version, and then there's Hot Docs and Contract Express. Those can be integrated with Intapp.
That's right. Yeah. So if your firm already has an investment in an application like Contract Express, you can use that or use the Intapp module that they offer.
And then you're spending time mapping your intake form, the questions you've already filled out, spent time finding answers to the document that's auto-generated, filled out, and attached to the intake process.
That's right.
You need to copy paste into another Word doc. So I think that's really, I found that, you know, firms that have implemented that to find that helpful. And then of course, like you guys mentioned, just like kind of creating kind of a process within the workflow allows them to kind of, hey, prompt people to be like, hey, is your engagement letter signed? So.
Yeah,
Right.
and how you answer the form can determine which template you're using. So there's some flexibility there as well.
I think there's a benefit too in, Rich, you mentioned like sort of risk mitigation. We definitely have a lot of firms where, you know, ELs are sort of Wild West situation with each attorney, like, so what did you send out in that engagement letter? But if it's all in the workflow, then everybody can see what was in there and it's much easier to enforce compliance.
Yeah, I think it's a quick win to turn that on and use it.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Rather than separating the engagement letter, which really is dependent on the intake process, you're bringing it into the one process. You're preventing double entry or copy paste, and you're standardizing the templates used, and you're standardizing potentially where that document could go after the fact. And we're solving the problem. Sorry, go ahead, Rich.
I was gonna say, and if you have terms, you can load it right in the terms from there when you get it back. So
Exactly. And you're solving the problem of a lot of pushback with waiting on a signed engagement letters. I need a matter to bill. I don't want to wait.
Yep.
That problem has been solved based on what JP is saying at a workflow step that allows you to create the matter, but then stops and waits and has what we'll call a task item there, sending an email out on a regular interval to say, hey, this engagement letter still needs to be signed.
Just,
right.
you know, when you do deploy it from dev environment to production, remember to change those minutes to days or weeks.
Right.
I think every 5 minutes gets your point across.
So yeah, that allows them to get a matter quickly, but also has an item out there that says you still need this engagement letter. Before this solution, I think we found firms that would just sticky note or some kind of reminder, but it's not at the forefront. It's not going to be collected, or just they don't know where it is. They can't find it. And that's the next piece, as you mentioned, sending it to terms. Also could be sent to whatever DMS they use as another step. So you have the whole life cycle of the document collection, signature, and then storage. Cool. That's great. Let's go on and talk about a little bit about project structure, because I do think that falls into the ROI side of things too. Whether you're starting a new project or just adding to an existing project. And JP, this is for you. For a client that's going to do a new project, whether it be implementing Intapp for the first time or a new module to it, or just updating something, what do you see in projects on staffing wise from the firm? What are the roles and those roles that are needed in order to make that project most successful?
Yeah, so in terms of just like working with project teams, you know, the project structure and methodology, I think, is important. And I think that's one thing that, you know, we try and establish in the beginning of projects. And one of it is, of course, building our team. So really having the team members that you need, like project manager, both on the partner side as well as like the firm side, I think is important. And then bringing in the subject matter experts and the people that make key decisions when you're doing the requirements gathering in the very beginning of the project is really critical. And then, of course, as you go into you know, testing and validating what has been developed, the actual users of the system. So bringing assistants, attorneys, you know, and the people that are actually utilizing the application, because then that truly gives you a robust idea of like, how is it going to be realistically, you know, going to work. You know, part of our process, you know, again, building a structure is really, again, that's what we emphasize, because that's where the lag of project schedules and tend to be, because those resources aren't identified ahead of time and then also not necessarily given the space to be able to participate, you know, fully, since, you know, everyone has a day job and plus the projects are kind of, you know, additional items. So I think really building your team and making sure that they have, you know, you've selected the folks that are going to get involved and giving them the opportunity and a time to participate, I think is important. And then, of course, the project structure, I think, is also just important in making sure a successful project happens, right? The methodology that we follow. So here, you know, here at our Wilson, we do kind of a waterfall and agile, you know, sprint approach. And so we try to, do the waterfall approach for the entire, the length of the project. And then just as we're finishing up development, we're turning things over to the firms so that they're actually providing feedback. And then again, that's where the resources come in to provide, whether something works or doesn't work. And you're not surprised at the very end to say, oh, this isn't exactly what we talked about. So I think that's important in terms of just kind of taking that type of approach. And we found it successful with other clients.
Gotcha. So the roles really, we need representation on the client side from a project management perspective, also from a user perspective. Partners and vendors usually provide project managers, but there's still that need for someone on the other side to interface with things that we don't see behind the scene, right? So that's definitely still a very valuable role. Perfect.
I mean, sometimes it's like herding cats. Just kidding. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right, Rich, I'm going to go to you now on. I'm going to be careful with my words because the second you say customizations, people start to get worried. But really, it's configuration, and the application is built to allow for that. There are scenarios where customizations happen, but usually it's configuration. But with standard, so when we go do deployments, usually we're scoping it as a kind of a standard way, right? But during the implementation process, what factors do you think should be considered when you are bouncing between a configuration item versus standard items?
Yeah, I think it's important, especially during the initial implementation, to stick to that vanilla standard configuration. Too often we find ourselves trying to configure for the 5 and 10% of new business that comes in, and that's where things sort of go off the rails project wise. But if there's a scenario that happens once or twice a month, maybe that makes more sense to fire out like an exception notification rather than trying to build some process around how that matter is going to be handled or created in the PMS system. So if we want to stay on track, stay on budget, stay on time, let's not bite off more than we can chew with that initial implementation.
So you're saying the 5 to 10% scenarios where we're trying to find a solution for, and we stop and ask the question, well, what is the time to value on this item? Is it really worth drilling in and spending the hours to find the solution for this 5 to 10%?
And if we find out it does, maybe that makes sense as a phase 2, but you want to get the software stood up and using it because you've made this investment into a shiny new conflicts and intake system. You don't want to waste time building around these one-off scenarios.
Right. And if we go and say to the firm, and as consultants, this is really our job, is to say, what you're asking, here's the potential cost and time and effects to your timeline. And then they make the decision from there. And if the answer is yes, that's okay, right? Is because we've presented the information on and found that, yes, the time to value is worth it. So let's move forward with that.
And I think that's like what we're kind of pushing here in this kind of discussions, right? Is, yes, you have the, when you implement, you kind of want to again kind of get, quick return to your investment. And, if we do a phased approach, it reminds you that, hey, there are these great things that the system can do, and, you can incorporate, prioritize that and make sure it's in your, roadmap for the coming year. So I think that's important.
And I've looked at the attendees list. I have none of our current clients in mind when I make those comments, Kurt. So.
Okay. You caught me off guard there. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on to Augustine because he's also been quiet now. And this is going to go back to more of data leveraging. Like we talked about the analytics side of things on the workflow front, but then there's all the other things that are outside of that world of the workflow and intake. because you've got like several systems that we're connected to that each hold its own unique information. And that's really the big push now, not just with Intapp world, but a lot of applications is one place you can go to see all this information, which, you know, is a hard thing to do because each system has its own value and you can't make one system do everything. That being said, Augustine, what have you seen organizations or firms use in the Intapp application or even in their intake process that gives them that competitive advantage?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of opportunity when you're taking on a new matter to make more informed, better data-driven decisions. You know, there's a huge, I think, efficiency gain and transparency gain when you just implement the system, just because you get an audit log and you have much more granular information about the workflow. But that can help you make process decisions down the road, as I sort of talked about earlier. But really, when you're taking on new work, you have an opportunity, like you have sort of decision makers there ready to go. And so one of the best examples of this is a firm that basically went, and what they did was they brought a bunch of their financial information into this, like more financial information than we would normally bring in. Normally we bring in just WIP, AR, things like that. But they brought in bucketed WIP, and they brought it in not just at the client matter level, but at the attorney level. And they went through and they did a risk assessment basically per attorney, and assigned attorneys a actual like a credit score type deal. And so when they're doing their risk analysis and they're taking on these new matters, they're not just looking at like, hey, does this client have 90-day-old AR or WIP or whatever. They're looking at, like, in general, how does this billing attorney or this responsible attorney actually perform? Do they have really good billing hygiene? Do they have lots of write-offs, write-downs, and whatnot? And those things contribute to the risk of the matter. And so they do this sort of like holistic matter risk assessment when they're onboarding their matters. And they found that after implementation of this in conjunction with a sort of matter financial risk monitoring setup, that during COVID, they were actually able to, like, right when COVID hit, sort of a couple of months after that, they were able to sort of start giving out bonuses again and like pay raises, which, obviously huge impact for the firm during a time of broad financial uncertainty for a lot of firms. So yeah, another opportunity where I feel like there's some unrealized potential in the market.
That's one of my favorite things that we've talked about in the past and what you've done. And I just think every firm has this data. It's just, it's not being necessarily leveraged that way.
Right.
So
yeah, the right people don't have access at the right time, or just, it's really about, barrier to access, right? You got a decision maker that's in a crunch moment, just like they don't have a lot of time to sit there and do research. If you can present it all to them at the time they're making the decision, it's much easier for them to make the right decision with the right information. And for me, the obviously right place there is like when I'm approving the matter.
Exactly. And you are taking all of this information, figuring out or building up a profile, essentially, of a financial profile of a client matter, and you're empowering people that normally wouldn't be able to make those informative decisions without pulling in lots of other people right in the intake process. Like, I think you mentioned it, like you're giving it a risk score, and you could put potentially a data entry person in front of that, and they could see, okay, well, this is a 5, so that means it goes down this path of the workflow, or it's high risk, we don't want to do it. But also display information, like it sounds like you said you're almost scoring attorneys in addition to the client and or matter.
Yeah, so you could have a situation where the client, say you're onboarding a new client and it's a mid-size corporate entity, no history of credit risk or anything like that, but the attorney that's bringing it in just has tons and tons and tons of write-offs. So you may still want to accept that business, but automatically right off the bat that matter should be flagged for enhanced oversight. Like you can just go into data manager, check a box and say, okay, well now this matter is flagged for enhanced oversight, and we can get ahead of the billing problems before anything, before any bill even goes out. Like we're on top of it because we know that this is going to be a potential risk when we accept it. Similarly, you have maybe have an individual that like doesn't have quite as clear of a financial history, might be normally flagged as a risk, but the partner who's bringing it in has like impeccable billing history, never has write-offs, write-downs. You automatically know that that's probably going to be a less risky matter for the firm to take on than if some other attorney was behind it.
And you're saying that if I go in and I start the intake process in Intapp or whatever, and I select the client, this information is pulled up and displayed in that process, or is it something separate?
Yeah, so we've got it in a couple different places. So one, if you have an existing client, obviously you've got a pretty extensive history there. So for this client, the use case that I'm talking about, we were storing pre-aggregate. So we did all the math already. We weren't doing it in the form. It was already done for each billing partner, for each billing attorney. So we already knew what that was coming in. And then for existing clients, we did that. And then we combined that with like a risk calculus in the form. And then, we just put a big old banner up at the top of the form that shows like, kind of like a data table that shows like, hey, this is a high risk client. Here are the factors that went into it. And so when the decision maker comes in, they're not digging into different parts of the form. It's right there at the top of where they need to click approve. They have the important financial bits about either the risk that the attorney poses or the risk that the client poses. And it's just really easy for them to digest that and make the decision.